Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Matt Berger, so why do I use the handle Dr. Noir? Well, I have a doctorate in epidemiology. I'm also a huge fan of what French film critic Nino Franck first dubbed, quote, film noir upon seeing American-made films in the summer of 1946 for the first time since the Nazi invasion of France 6 years earlier. In 2017, during my fourth of 5 consecutive visits to the Noir City Film Festival in San Francisco, a friend from Yale dubbed me Dr. Noir, possibly riffing off Doctor Strange, released the previous year. This channel, meanwhile, is an extension of my website called Just Bear With Me, which I launched in December 2016. The title gently pokes fun at my storytelling style, in which I pile detail upon detail before ultimately getting to the point. Which I always do. Okay, almost always do. Inspired by the data journalism of 538.com and nearly 2 decades as a professional data analyst, I wanted to force myself to summarize various data analyses I do for fun. During those 2 decades, I earned my doctorate as well as a master's degree in biostatistics. Through early March 2023, I have written 251 distinct essays. Fully 101, or 40%, address American politics, making it the most common topic, broadly speaking, on my website. You see, before becoming a data analyst, I earned 2 degrees in political science, one from Yale and one a kind of consolation master's degree from Harvard after spending 6 years not finishing a doctorate. Specific topics aside, though, the most common narrative structure on my website is what I call contextualized introspection. I combine something cultural or historical with events from my own life to tell a larger, richer story. For example, I use the 1996 film Beautiful Girls plus aspects of my turbulent romantic history to discuss unrealistic cinematic expectations. The death of Republican Senator John McCain, whom I admired, and my experience as a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat raised in the moderate Republican suburbs of Philadelphia spurred a call for renewed bipartisanship. I am particularly proud of my 2 essays on the 1976 television movie Sybil, which I invite you to read. The second one packs a deeply personal wallop. Meanwhile, because measurement and score construction fascinate me, I published Ranking Every Charlie Chan Film in August 2017. After a slow start, it became my most read essay. Its total views are more than the next 2 essays combined. My wife now thinks it is a, quote, no-brainer to turn that essay into a video. Sure, I reply, but what about all the math? This was my first attempt to combine what you could call wisdom of the crowd measures, IMDb ratings, Rotten Tomatoes scores, Leonard Maltin stars, into a single measure of what I call perceived quality. I recently calculated PQ scores for the first 23 films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as well as the 700 plus films and counting I have seen more than once. But sometimes, you stumble upon a metric that completely upends everything that came before it. I never attended film school, and I try to avoid textual or structural analyses of film. So not my bailiwick. What I have done, though, is watch nearly 800 films that could be considered film noir. I have read and own some 40 books on the subject, and I've watched a plethora of YouTube videos. After 5 trips to San Francisco, I helped to establish Noir City Boston in 2018. That fall, I taught a course on film noir through Brookline's adult and community education program. In September 2014, meanwhile, I decided to rank my favorite films noir for my upcoming 48th birthday. To jog my memory, I explored the 13 or so references I then had, including the 2014 Noir City program. The following March, having purchased two more massive new volumes, I steeled myself to create a far more comprehensive Excel workbook of titles with much more information about each film, which took 2 years to complete. For details, I refer you to Chapter 6 of Interrogating Memory, but the upshot was this. There is remarkably little agreement among recognized authorities on film noir regarding what films are, noir. In fact, of the 4,825 films, at least one of 32 different authorities labels noir, either explicitly or implicitly. Just under half were cited only once, out of a maximum of 32. 5 out of 6 were cited at most 6 times. By contrast, only 524 films, or 11%, were cited more than 10 times, and only 175, or 4%, were cited more than 20 times, again, out of a maximum of 32. Finally, only 23 films were cited 30 or more times. There's a list in the description below, of which only The Postman Always Rings Twice, Kiss Me Deadly, The Maltese Falcon, and Double Indemnity were cited the maximum 32 times. This revelation that there is far less agreement on which films are considered noir led me to another conclusion. No single universally agreed upon definition of film noir exists. There is a very good reason for that. As I said, it was not until the mid 1940s that critics observed something darker and more violent in recent American crime films. Lloyd Shearer did not use the term film noir in his August 5th, 1945 article in the New York Times, instead calling them lusty, hard-boiled gut and gore crime stories. Frank's article appeared in L'Écran Français exactly 1 year later. Fellow critic Jean-Pierre Chartier, writing 3 months after Frank, was not especially impressed by American, quote, noir films, much preferring the French poetic realist films of the 1930s. The thing is, these three authors cited a grand total of just 14 films, and only Double Indemnity and Murder My Sweet were cited by all three, as characteristic of this new film style. Just 14 films formed the basis for what we now call film noir. 14. Even then, it took until 1955 for the term to gain any traction, assuming you could read French, that is. That year, French film critics Raymond Baudet and Etienne Chaumeton synthesized fewer than 100 films in their seminal Panorama of American Film Noir. Moreover, by 1955, when Panorama was first released, the classic era of film noir was nearing its conclusion. And even then, the term did not penetrate the public consciousness until 1972, at the earliest, when an insightful young UCLA film student named Paul Schrader wrote what I think is the single best piece on this topic, Notes on Film Noir. Put simply, a handful of critics, years after the fact, reverse engineered a definition for a type of film nobody knew they were creating while they were creating them. No wonder we cannot agree upon which films are noir, let alone on a standard definition. Still, the idea of a master list of films noir is so entrenched that I find it very difficult to persuade people otherwise. Look at Wikipedia, they say, shattering their credibility, for me at least. I'll just point to the Panorama, which is a lot more reasonable. Except Baudet and Chaumeton only discuss a total of 255 films in the 1979 reissue. By contrast, 22 other sources that I've examined cite more titles, with 4 citing 1,000 or more. I make 2 observations here. One, you can see how data-driven my approach to film analysis and, well, everything is. 2, I should not have been surprised by how resistant people are to changing deeply held views. Updating your priors is what we Bayesian thinkers call it. The term was inspired by the premier film analysts on YouTube who are always, quote, interrogating films, their plots, their themes, their settings, their mise en scène, their narrative arcs, their cinematography, you name it. In July 2017, when I began to turn an essay about why I love film noir into a full length book, I figured I would simply flesh out my life experiences with all of the family and personal background I recalled. I soon realized, though, how little I truly recalled about my ancestors, mostly because I'd never known this stuff in the first place. This was especially true of my father's family for reasons I will not go into here. There were also stories whose veracity I questioned, like my descent from the dancing rabbi of Shpola, the origins of two fires in my childhood, that maybe close friend when I was like 4 who vanished, maybe because of a fire, and that time my father was given a baby's rattle at the dinner table instead of silverware. On top of that was my in utero adoption in 1966, which I'd avoided learning more about for decades. Even details for my own life needed clarifying, if only because my epidemiological training taught me to be as precise as possible. Echoing analogous difficulties with film noir, meanwhile, I'm still working on defining interrogating memory precisely. On my website, though, I list 5 key elements: fact checking, meticulous curiosity, everyone has a story to tell, willingness to learn the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and critical thinking. Or, as I put it in the preface, interrogating memory could be considered the love child of psychoanalysis, patiently probing memories, and the epistemological underpinnings of epidemiology, questioning and verifying everything, raised on a steady diet of persistence and a genuine love of history and mystery. Or, to put it even more simply, it is using every technique in your critical toolbox to answer the question, hold on, is that really how it happened? I then observe how politicized our very sources of information, a kind of civic epistemology, had already become in 2017. It has only gotten worse since then. Getting otherwise sensible and reasonable folks to change their perception of something as mundane as film noir is a very heavy lift. That lift only gets heavier the more, quote, serious the subject is. But it is perhaps the most important work we can do in a time of hyper-partisan information silos and social media disinformation campaigns. I myself had to let go of cherished stories when writing interrogating memory, but the carefully established facts simply did not support them. To continue to accept those stories as truth would have been absurd. So, what is it that I bring to the table? Here I recall Joe Pesci's character Leonard Bernsey Bernstein's contention in the public eye that everyone likes having their picture took. Everyone. Everyone has a profound and interesting personal story or stories to tell, so long as they do the careful work to find them. I take that idea even further by putting personal histories in a cultural and historic context, and vice versa. It turns out homes, motels, and apartment complexes also all have tales to tell. And what I learned about the tragic and mysterious death of my grandfather, about family friends who were also convicted arsonists and extortionists, and even that time she found him naked or mostly naked in a hotel room with her cousin, more than made up for the loss of other stories. We interact with so called history all the time. That same great grandfather, the one who died under tragic and mysterious circumstances, sold his house to make room for Philadelphia's prestigious Benjamin Franklin Parkway while running a delicatessen just 1 block west of the imposing walls of Eastern State Penitentiary. Relatives anglicized their overly Semitic names to blend in better with their new Philadelphia neighbors, and in one case to serve as a cop for 22 years. That he served as a detective during the very height of the classic era of film noir shows that it all connects: the personal, the historical, and the cultural. That is my brand, if you will, weaving these elements into a single interlocking narrative. When I started Just Bear With Me, I vowed only to publish when I had something genuinely interesting to say. At this point, then, I have no idea what videos I will post when. I can only promise to be as accurate and compelling as I can be when inspiration strikes.